Rushline Environmental Assessment Open House. We will begin with a 35-minute presentation about the project and about the environmental assessment. And then following the presentation, the rest of the time will be available for question and answer with staff. And for the question and answer period, we will first respond to the questions submitted in writing in the Q&A box. And you can get to the Q&A box by clicking on that Q&A icon on the very bottom of your screen in the panel there. Click on that and submit your question in writing. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and then we will start addressing them immediately after the presentation. After written questions have been answered, we will move on to verbal questions. So if you feel more comfortable asking your question verbally, there'll be an opportunity to do that. We will start with verbal questions in Hmong, and then we will do verbal questions in Spanish, then Korean, and then finally in English. We will get started with the presentation now. We may take a few brief pauses in the presentation so that our interpreters have a chance to keep up with the content. And we can start the presentation.
Hello, I am Ramsey County Commissioner Victoria Reinhardt. Welcome to the Rushline BRT Project Environmental Assessment Open House. Your review of and feedback on this key document is important and will help inform Rushline's next steps towards providing a safe, clean, and quiet all-day connection to jobs, businesses, shopping, medical facilities, entertainment venues, and more. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Reinhardt, for those welcoming remarks. My name is Andy Gitzloff, Senior Transportation Planner at Ramsey County, and I would first like to start this virtual open house with a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hopes of a better life, and some have lived on this land since immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We are standing on the ancestral lands of the Dakota people. We want to acknowledge the Ojibwe, the Ho-Chunk, and the other nations of people who also call this place home. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the treaties made by the tribal nations that entitle non-Native people to live and work on traditional Native lands. Consider that many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths as any and all public events. Our topics for today that we would like to cover are first to go over the virtual meeting procedures, followed by more detail on where to view the environmental assessment and how to comment. Then we will be providing project background and overview, an overview of the environmental assessment, including its purpose and the topics covered within the documents. And then we will cover next steps. And after the presentation portion, we will break and there will be a question and answer period with project staff. Now to go over the virtual meeting procedures. Attendees may ask questions by using the Q&A or the raised hand feature only during the discussion period of the open house. The host will unmute you in the order of hands raised. This open house is being recorded and a summary of the Q&A will be provided in the environmental decision document. Email avalenti@srfconsulting.com if you're having issues connecting. Closed captioning and interpretation services are available for this meeting. Select your preferred language by clicking the globe icon at the bottom of the screen. The EA can be viewed at many different places. www.rushline.org can be viewed online. There are also a number of locations throughout the east side of the metro where the document can be reviewed, including the Ramsey County Law Library, the Eastside Enterprise Center, the Ramsey County Library in Maplewood, Vadnais Heights City Hall, Gem Lake City Hall, and Ramsey County Library in White Bear Lake. Please check with each organization before visiting, as their hours may be different due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are also interested in receiving your comments on the environmental assessment document, and they can be submitted in a variety of ways. Submitting official comments can be submitted via email to info@rushline.org. You can also visit the environmental process page and fill out a comment form on rushline.org, or you can mail the comment letters to Andy Gitzloff, Senior Transportation Planner at Ramsey County, and the address is 15 West Kellogg Boulevard, Suite 210, Courthouse, St. Paul, Minnesota, 55102. All substantive comments will be responded to in the environmental decision documents, which will be published later.
Thank you. My name is Frank Alarcon. I'm a transit planner at Ramsey County Public Works and the Deputy Project Manager for the Rushline BRT project. I'll be sharing about the project's background and giving an overview of the project. First, I'll review the project's timeline. From 2014 to 2017, Ramsey County led the pre-project development study. This study evaluated 55 route segments and 7 forms of bus and rail-based transit to identify what's called the locally preferred alternative. The locally preferred alternative is a route and a mode of transit, in this case, bus rapid transit. The current phase of work is the environmental analysis phase, which began in 2018 and is also led by Ramsey County. As the name suggests, a key task of the environmental analysis phase is preparation of an environmental assessment to document any potential environmental impacts of the project. In order to evaluate environmental impacts, a certain amount of engineering must be done to identify the infrastructure that will be constructed as part of the project. So preliminary engineering is another key task of this phase of work. Preliminary station area planning work has also been performed. Station area planning focuses on refining station locations, identifying ways to improve biking and walking connections near stations, and identifying economic development opportunities near stations. All of this work has been informed by public engagement. During the environmental analysis phase, project staff have connected with more than 3,400 community members at over 160 community events, pop-up meetings, open houses, virtual events, and through a variety of other forums. The public comment period for the environmental assessment is one of the last steps of the environmental analysis phase. When this phase of work concludes later this year, the leadership of the project is expected to transition from Ramsey County to the Metropolitan Council. The Metropolitan Council will lead the project through final engineering and construction and ultimately operate the Rushline BRT as part of the regional transit system. Construction is expected to begin in 2024 and finish in 2026. Here's some more detail about the locally preferred alternative, which again is the project's route and the mode of transit. So the mode of transit for the Rushline is dedicated guideway, BRT. What dedicated guideway means is that for a large portion of the Rushline's route, the bus will operate in its own dedicated lane, which speeds up the service and makes it more reliable. The Rushline will have frequent service from early in the morning to late at night, approximately every 10 to 15 minute service for most of the day. The route, if you're starting in downtown St. Paul, will operate largely on 5th Street and 6th Street and Robert Street within downtown. Then it takes Jackson over to Phelan Boulevard, north of downtown and on the east side. And then it will operate within the Ramsey County Rail right-of-way on the east side and into Maplewood. So that's the yellow portion of the map. And within the Ramsey County rail right-of-way, the Rush Line will share the right-of-way with a reconstructed Bruce Bento Regional Trail. North of the Ramsey County Rail right-of-way, the Rush Line will largely operate on Highway 61 into downtown White Bear Lake. Also part of the project involves exploring potential future bus connections to Hugo and Forest Lake, as well as other bus system improvements to help facilitate transfers to and from the Rush Line. This graphic shows the region's future rapid transit network and how the Rush Line, which is in the top right-hand corner in purple, fits into that system and connects to other corridors. Next, I'll review the characteristics of BRT that make it a high-quality form of transit service. One characteristic is that BRT vehicles operate largely in their own dedicated lanes, which speeds up service and makes it more reliable because buses are separated from general traffic. BRT buses also run frequently, every 10 to 15 minutes in both directions for most of the day. This allows people to use the service for many types of trip throughout the day and not have to rely on a schedule. BRT stations have many amenities that create a safe and comfortable environment for riders. These amenities include shelter, heat, and real-time departure signs. Raised platforms allow riders to enter and exit buses more easily. Riders pay their fares at the station rather than on the bus, speeding up the boarding process and allowing riders to board at any door. BRT vehicles are modern, state-of-the-art buses. The Rush Line's environmental assessment assumes that electric buses will be used for the Rush Line BRT. Now I'll hand it over to Jessica Lobbs, environmental lead for the Rush Line project, to discuss the environmental assessment.
We will now provide an overview of the environmental assessment. An environmental assessment is an analysis required by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, that evaluates impacts and benefits from proposed projects. The purpose of an environmental assessment is to ensure the project complies with environmental laws, to evaluate project benefits and impacts to environmental, social, economic, and transportation resources. If necessary, it identifies solutions to avoid, minimize, and mitigate project impacts. And it also serves to inform the public and agencies about impacts as part of the decision-making process. There are many agencies involved in preparation of the environmental assessment for the Rush Line BRT project. Because Ramsey County and the Metropolitan Council will pursue project funding through the Federal Transit Administration's Capital Investment Grants Program, the Federal Transit Administration is the lead governmental agency for preparation of the environmental assessment. Ramsey County is the project sponsor and the responsible governmental unit for the state environmental review process. The Federal Highway Administration is a cooperating agency. In this role, they will provide input on the project's purpose and need, impacts, the definition of alternatives, and the resource analyses. This image depicts the decision-making process for the environmental assessment, starting with where we are today. Currently in step 1, we are in the agency and public review period for the environmental assessment. Once that review period is over, the Federal Transit Administration and Ramsey County will review all of the comments. In step 3, the Federal Transit Administration will issue an environmental decision document. This will respond to substantive comments on the environmental assessment and identify ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate impacts. This document will also determine that the project does not have significant impacts, or that it requires additional analysis. In step 4, if the Federal Transit Administration finds that no additional analysis is required, it will issue a finding of no significant impact. At this point, the project can continue into design and eventually construction. If it's determined that additional analysis is needed to obtain environmental approval, an environmental impact statement will be prepared for potentially significant impacts, or additional analysis will be completed under the environmental assessment. In either option, there will be the opportunity for agency and public review and comment. Once the Federal Transit Administration determines that no additional analysis is needed, the project can move into step 5, final design and engineering, and then eventually construction. There are a wide range of topics covered in the environmental assessment, including the project's purpose and need, a summary of public and agency coordination, a description of the alternatives evaluated, analysis of transportation, community and social, physical and environmental, and Section 4F resources, consideration of indirect effects and cumulative impacts, and an assessment of Section 106 resources, which include historic and cultural elements. The purpose of the Rush Line BRT project is to provide transit service that satisfies the long-term regional mobility and accessibility needs for businesses and the traveling public, and supports sustainable development within the study area. The specific needs driving this project include serving the needs of people who rely on transit, meeting increasing demand for reliable high-frequency transit service, planning for sustainable growth and development, and expanding multimodal travel options. Throughout the environmental assessment process, the Rush Line project team conducted extensive public and agency coordination. With the general public, we spoke with more than 3,400 people at more than 160 engagement events, like the picture you see here at Fiesta Latina. On the agency side, we formed project advisory committees of our agency partners and also conducted several resource-specific agency meetings with the Army Corps of Engineers, Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, and more. The environmental assessment evaluates a build alternative, which includes bus rapid transit between Union Depot in St. Paul and downtown White Bear Lake. The build alternative is evaluated both with and without a park and ride at the Highway 36 station. A no-build alternative is also evaluated for comparison. We will now walk through a summary of potential impacts to the resources evaluated in the environmental assessment. These resources are evaluated for potential impacts on a scale of no concern, short-term impacts or construction impacts, and longer-term impacts associated with the Rush Line BRT project. Starting with transportation resources, the environmental assessment reports that short-term and long-term impacts are anticipated in the areas of traffic, transit, parking, driveways and loading zones, and pedestrian and bicycle facilities. For freight rail, short-term impacts are anticipated, and for aviation facilities, no concern for potential impacts was noted. To more specifically address potential impacts to transportation resources, under traffic, queuing issues were identified at certain intersections. This will be addressed by adjusting turning lanes and implementing transit signal priority and traffic signal phasing. Under transit, The Rush Line BRT is expected to attract new riders. Any potential temporary stop, relocations, closures, or bus route detours would be communicated in advance. Under parking, driveways, and loading zones, with the build alternative, there would be a net gain of parking spaces in the corridor. However, without the Highway 36 park and ride, there would be a net loss of parking spaces. Regarding other permanent impacts, no loading zones would be affected. There is loss of one driveway in a commercial area. That property does have access to other driveways. To minimize temporary impacts during construction, there would be a construction staging plan. For pedestrian and bicycle facilities, new connections and upgrades would be made to existing facilities. Segments of the Bruce Bento Regional Trail would be reconstructed, and the planned in-street bike lane on Phelan Boulevard would not be built, but the adjacent Bruce Bento Regional Trail is available to cyclists. For freight rail, no permanent impacts are anticipated, but temporary construction easements would affect small portions of 3 railroad properties. In the evaluation of community and social resources, it was identified that land use compatibility and environmental justice resulted in no concern for impacts. Neighborhoods and community resources, land acquisitions and relocations, visual resources, and economics all result in both short-term and long-term impacts. For safety and security, short-term impacts are anticipated. For neighborhoods and community resources, the Rush Line BRT project would improve access to many community facilities in the corridor. Minor partial acquisitions would be required along the edge of community facility properties, but would not include any buildings or impede any property's primary use. During construction, traffic detours, sidewalk closures, and noise and dust may temporarily affect traffic patterns and neighborhood character. Under land acquisitions and relocations, no full acquisitions would be required. All acquisitions, whether temporary or permanent, would be partial acquisitions that would not include any buildings or impede on the primary use of any property. In the evaluation of visual resources, it was determined that construction of the BRT guideway and stations would create moderate to high visual contrast in some locations of the corridor in both the short term and long term. Mitigation measures include change in station locations in some areas and creation of the Ramsey County Rail Right-of-Way Design Guide, which was created in coordination with the public and key stakeholders. Under economics, there would be no full commercial property acquisitions or business displacements. There would be some partial temporary construction easements and permanent acquisitions needed. Temporary and permanent loss of on and off-street parking spaces is not anticipated to have adverse impacts. During construction, there would be short-term impacts to businesses. To address impacts related to safety and security, safety programs, public information efforts, and other measures would be implemented to mitigate potential safety risks posed by construction activity. Safety and security plans for Rush Line BRT operations would be created in coordination with local law enforcement and emergency response personnel. Where short-term closures may be needed during construction, detour routes would be created for pedestrian, bicycle, and vehicle traffic. On the subject of environmental justice, based on comprehensive analysis, no disproportionately high and adverse effects on minority and low-income populations were identified in the study area. The project is anticipated to have benefits to these populations, including improved access to community facilities and overall economic benefits. In the evaluation of physical and environmental resources, both short-term and long-term potential impacts were identified for utilities, water quality and stormwater, hazardous materials, and protected species and wildlife habitat. Short-term impacts were identified for geology, groundwater and soils, and noise and vibration, as well as air quality. Long-term impacts were identified for surface waters. Both energy and farmlands are expected to be of no concern. Regarding utility impacts, permanent impacts can be avoided, minimized, and mitigated with input from utility owners. Minimal service disruptions are anticipated to occur during construction. Utility owners would decide if these happen and when they happen. For surface water, there are floodplain impacts resulting from stormwater management features or modifications to the roadway. Mitigation is being coordinated with watershed districts and other appropriate agencies. For wetlands, the project is anticipated to impact just over 1 acre across 5 wetlands, which are regulated under the Minnesota Wetland Conservation Act. Of these impacts, about 1/4 of an acre across 3 wetlands are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under the Clean Water Act. For water quality and stormwater, approximately 27 acres of new impervious surface and 26 acres of reconstructed impervious surface are anticipated. Mitigation will be coordinated with watershed districts, the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Potential locations for stormwater management features, like ponds or underground elements, were included in the evaluation of the project. During construction, paved and vegetated areas would be disturbed, requiring temporary stormwater management. For geology, groundwater, and soils, no permanent impacts are anticipated, but during construction, dewatering would be coordinated with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources if needed. Erosion control measures will be used as needed, and if any soils are removed, they will be disposed of or reused in accordance with local ordinances. Regarding hazardous materials, site mitigation and management of contaminated and regulated materials would occur as needed. It is anticipated that no hazardous or regulated materials would be produced as part of the Rushline BRT project. Any waste from vehicle upkeep would be performed in accordance with industry standards. For noise and vibration, no long-term impacts are anticipated. Temporary noise impacts may result from construction, and a noise and vibration control plan will be provided to mitigate these impacts. For air quality, no long-term impacts are anticipated, but during construction, temporary road closures or capacity reductions may result in traffic detouring to parallel roadways. This may increase emissions and air pollutants temporarily. These are not anticipated to generate concentrations exceeding air quality standards. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency recommended measures would be used to reduce these short-term impacts. In consideration of protected species and wildlife habitat, no adverse impacts are expected to protected species in the project area. Habitat for the endangered rusty-patched bumblebee and the candidate for listing monarch butterfly is present within the project corridor. Any potential impacts to habitat will be mitigated by commitment to reseed disturbed areas with native seed mixes. There is also potential to encounter the state-protected Blandings turtle during construction. Best practices from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources will be followed for work within or near the turtle's habitat. Short-term impacts will be mitigated through erosion control, stabilization, and other best management practices. Both short-term and long-term potential impacts have been identified as a result of the Rushline BRT project for Section 4F resources and historic properties. Section 6F properties are not present within the corridor. These properties are governed by Section 4F of the Transportation Act of 1966. Section 4F is a federal law that protects publicly owned parks, recreation areas, and wildlife and/or waterfowl refuges, and publicly or privately owned significant historic sites. The 4F evaluation of impacts considers if a project would permanently incorporate or temporarily occupy any such land, or would substantially impair protected features due to the project's proximity. A project cannot use a Section 4F resource unless the Federal Transit Administration determines that the project would have a de minimis impact, or that there is no feasible and prudent avoidance alternative, and the project includes all possible planning to minimize harm to the 4F property. For the Rushline BRT project, the Federal Transit Administration has complied with Section 4F by identifying the protected properties within the project area, consulting with the officials that have jurisdiction of those properties, assessing potential impacts and examining ways to avoid those impacts, and identifying potential minimization and mitigation strategies. As a result of this analysis, the Federal Transit Administration has determined that 4 properties in the corridor result in Section 4F de minimis impacts. These are East Side Heritage Park and Phelan Park in the city of St. Paul, Harvest Park in the city of Maplewood, and Weaver Elementary School. It has also been determined that the project will result in a Section 4F use of the following historic sites: the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad Corridor Historic District in the segment from St. Paul to White Bear Lake, and 3 segments of the 1868 alignment of the same railroad located between Eldridge Avenue and County Road B East, Jervis Avenue and County Road C, and Coleman Avenue and Beam Avenue. Evaluation of historic properties requires compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. This requires federal agencies to consider the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. An historic property is any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. We commonly refer to these resources as architectural or above ground, or archaeological or below ground. The National Register of Historic Places is an official list of properties recognized for their significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, engineering, and culture. To be listed, a property must retain sufficient integrity to convey its significance and meet one or more of the following criteria. Criterion A, associated with events, activities, or broad patterns of history. Criterion B, associated with persons significant in the past. Criterion C, associated with characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. Or criterion D, which indicates the potential to yield additional historic information. There are 4 primary steps in the Section 106 process. In step 1, the process is initiated by inviting the State Historic Preservation Office, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, and other interested parties into consultation. These are called consulting parties. And in the Rushline BRT project, we have consulting parties from each of the communities in the corridor, including representatives from the 2 historical societies and the 2 heritage preservation commissions. In step 2, historic properties within a defined area of potential effects are identified. In step 3, it is assessed how those historic properties might be affected by the proposed project. In step 4, if any adverse effects are identified, these are resolved by reaching an agreement with consulting parties on measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate the effects. In the assessment of effects, the Federal Transit Administration has determined that the Rushline BRT project will have an adverse effect on historic properties. Specifically, the project will have no adverse effect on 14 identified historic properties, no adverse effect with conditions on 9 historic properties, and an adverse effect on 5 historic properties. These properties include 2 segments of the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad Corridor Historic District and 3 segments of the railroad's 1868 alignment. The adverse effects to these resources are being resolved through consultation and are documented in the draft memorandum of agreement that is included in the environmental assessment. The Section 106 Memorandum of Agreement outlines the measures identified to avoid, minimize, or mitigate any adverse effects, identifies design, development, and review processes that will be followed before construction and during construction. It is available for public review and comment right now during the environmental assessment comment period. Public comments will be considered by the Federal Transit Administration in consultation with the Minnesota State Historic Preservation Office and all of the consulting parties prior to the agreement being finalized. The final document and associated reporting will be available at rushline.org.
Thank you, Jessica, for the summary of the environmental assessment process. I'd now like to speak a few words about the next steps in finalizing the environmental assessment and the environmental assessment worksheet. The comment period is running through June 25th. And in addition to the virtual open houses, we'll have an in-person open house on June 17th. This summer, we also expect concurrence from officials with jurisdiction on de minimis impacts to Section 4F resources. Section 4F resources deal with impacts to parks. And we'll also be finalizing the Section 106 Memorandum of Agreement. The Section 106 deals with historic and cultural property impacts. In the October timeframe, the Federal Transit Administration will issue an environmental decision document, and this will include final Section 4F determination. Ramsey County will also issue the state environmental decision document. The Federal Highway Administration will issue the environmental decision document as a cooperating agency, and this is needed for interstate right-of-way use approval where the project crosses over Interstate 694. In the fall-winter timeframe, the Rushline BRT project will transition to the Metropolitan Council once the environmental decision is reached. Metropolitan Council will be the lead local agency responsible for design, construction, and ultimate operation of the Rushline BRT project. We are now going to transition into the discussion portion of this virtual open house.
Great. So that concludes our presentation segment, and it's now time for the question and answer session. Before we dig into the questions, I just wanted to reiterate that if you have a comment on the Rushline BRT project, and especially on the environmental assessment, please feel free to submit that comment in writing via email to info@rushline.org, or you can use a form on the rushline.org website. Again, you could send it via mail to Andy Gitzloff at Ramsey County. And a note that substantive comments will be responded to in the environmental decision document, which will be published this coming fall, 2021. So getting into our question and answer session, a reminder that the emphasis here is on question and answer and less on comments. If you have comments, we ask that you please submit them in writing using the information I just provided. So please stay on topic, be respectful of everyone's time by keeping your comments brief and to the point, or your questions brief and to the point. And just a note, again, feel free to use the question and answer icon on the panel on the bottom, and we will answer all the written questions first, and then we'll move on to the verbal questions. The folks who will be answering your questions are from Andy Gitzloff and Frank Alarcon from Ramsey County, Barbara Howard from the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and Jeannie Witzig, Jessica Lobbs, and Jim Gersema from the Rushline Consultant Team. We, of course, are recording this meeting, and a summary of the question and answers will be provided as well in the final environmental decision document. So with that, I think we'll turn to our first written question, which was submitted by Linda, and that she asked, why build a dedicated guideway bridge over Interstate 694 if you could have used County Road D to Highway 61? And I will ask Andy to respond to this one.
Sure, thanks, Adele. And we did look at alternative routes, such as using County Road D over to 61, as opposed to building a new bridge. A couple of the reasons why a new bridge was decided upon. One, it does have a significant travel time savings going over to 61. There's a number of different traffic lights that the BRT would need to navigate. And that has two benefits. That makes it a quicker trip for riders, which makes it a more attractive service to potential riders. And it has the other benefit of the less time the bus is spent in operation, the less operation costs it has. So although there's an upfront capital cost for that new bridge, there is some operating savings that come along with that. And there also is some right of way that is available, property that's owned by the County Rail Authority and the county's Parks Department that's going to be used to be able to cross over that space.
Thanks, Andy. The next question is also for you. Randall asked if the rider projections listed on page 22 were developed before COVID-19, and if so, have those projections been updated?
Yes, so the ridership projections were developed before the COVID-19 pandemic. The way that projections are done is they're based on a number of different factors. One of those is how many people are currently riding the system and how has that changed over time. Other factors are what's called an onboard transit survey, where asking riders about their behavior and travel patterns and what they might use into the future. We also look at transportation travel patterns, as well as where there's existing population and employment density. So all those things factor into the ridership projections, and they're also based on year 2040. So as of now, we don't have enough data from last year and the initial part of the recovery to update those projections, but that will be something that's done as the project advances. Right now, we are in our environmental due diligence phase. As the project as the project moves forward, we'll continue to look at the ridership and make updates and adjustments where needed.
Thanks, Andy. Our next question from Catherine. For pedestrian safety, will there be a safer crossing of Highway 61 to access the Whitaker station for people who live and work on the west side of the train track? And I'll look to Jim to answer this question.
Yes, so one of the improvements that is being evaluated in this document is a new traffic control signal there at the intersection of Whitaker Street and Highway 61. And so there will be a different crossing treatment there for pedestrians who are crossing the roadway. And so we will have improvements there to control that crossing and allow time for pedestrians to cross the highway at that location.
Thanks, Jim. The next question is about starting the rush line on a smaller scale, running buses every 30 to 60 minutes and using an existing roadway on Arcade or Highway 61. And I'll look to Andy to answer this question.
Yes, thank you, Adele. A couple of things to keep in mind with the frequent service. The frequent service is the transit service that has seen the most demand in recent years, and actually during the pandemic has proven to be the most resilient. So when you get to 10 to 15 minutes of service, that's where you can travel without really having to rely on schedules and being able to make more trips and different types of trips to different types of destinations. So when you look at, not just serving jobs and employment centers in the morning and coming out in the evening, service all day as the economy recovers from the pandemic and people start to go back to shopping, destinations, events, other activities, appointments, maybe non-traditional work environments. We see that as the most resilient service that will come back as the frequent service of 10 to 15 minutes throughout the day.
Thanks, Andy. So our next question from Kelly is for Jessica, asking, what will be done to mitigate increases in noise from buses in areas where many buses do not currently run, such as in downtown White Bear Lake?
Sure. As Kelly also noted, the environmental assessment determined there wouldn't be long-term noise impacts in the corridor. And one reason for that, particularly in White Bear Lake, is that buses will be running on Highway 61. So higher traffic volume there. And also pointing out too that the BRT buses are rubber tired and assumed to be electric, which is a much quieter operation. So no particular noise mitigation is proposed.
Thanks, Jessica. So we've reached the end of our written questions, at least those submitted so far. So we'll take this opportunity to shift over to see if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask verbally. And we'll start with our folks on our other language channels. So first, I will ask Blong, our interpreter on the Hmong channel, if there are any questions that anyone would like to ask verbally on that channel. Sounds good. Thank you. Sounds good. We will move on to the Spanish channel. Maria, do you have any questions? Yes, I can hear you. I'm in the Spanish channel. I can hear you. Okay, I will. Okay, I'll move on to the Corinne channel. Anna, do you have any questions? Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we will go back to the English channel now, and we have received several questions in the written format, and we'll attempt to kind of work our way through these. And I think we'll start with the first question about how many trees are projected to be cleared and what species those trees are. And it looks like Jim, you might be the person to answer this.
I can sure try. I can tell you that I don't have the number of trees that are anticipated to be cleared at my fingertips. That is something that has not been gone to in that level of detail. There is going to be tree clearing in that Ramsey County right away where the Bruce Venture Trail goes through now. And there are a lot of different species of trees that are included in that. The level of impact to trees is still to be determined as the design goes forward, but we have in the environmental document assumed that there will be a significant portion of that corridor that has trees removed within the Ramsey County property, that no trees are planned to be removed on private property adjacent to that corridor. With that, there will be new trees to be planted and vegetation will be restored as the construction progresses. Details about that restoration are included in a design guide for the corridor that has been developed for the project.
Thanks, Jim. So we will move on to another question that came in asking how we obtain rider intention preference information if prospective riders are now working from home. And I will send this one back to Andy.
Yes, thank you, Adele. As stated previously, Metro Transit does an onboard ridership survey. That is done every few years. So it's anticipated that when the next update of that ridership onboard survey is done, we'll be farther into the pandemic recovery to better understand what future travel patterns look like. And as mentioned before, there will be opportunities as the project moves forward to continue to make adjustments. Construction isn't anticipated until 2024, which is approximately 3 more years of design work once the environmental work is complete. And just a note on remote work, what we found in studies that are out there is that less than 40% of jobs can be done from home. So that does leave remaining about 60% of jobs that cannot be done remotely. When you think about this corridor with a number of different service workers in hospital, in restaurants, in retail, in education, there are a lot of jobs that are going to need transit access even once the pandemic recovers. But as previously stated, we will continue to monitor and make adjustments as the project moves forward.
Thanks, Andy. I will also send this next question to you, asking if space will be lost from White Bear Lakes Railroad Park at 4th Street and Highway 61, and how can the busy intersection accommodate buses starting and stopping? And Andy, that one's for you as well.
I'm sorry, that broke up there for a second on my end. Can you repeat?
Oh, certainly. So the next question that I was sending to you was asking if space will be lost in White Bear Lakes Railroad Park at 4th and 61 for a new station, and can the busy intersection accommodate buses?
Yes, yes, thank you. So in that portion of the corridor, once the BRT route gets north of Whitaker Street, the buses simply operate in the regular lanes. There's no specific lane for transit. There's not enough space for that with the railroad and development there. So at the 4th Street intersection, we are not planning any changes at all. So there would be no impacts to Railroad Park.
Thank you. So maybe one clarification from the previous question, asking if federal funds for a transit project such as Rushline be used to clear trees and replant trees. Maybe I'll put that one back to Jim.
Yep. Sorry for maybe not covering that earlier. Yes, federal funds can be used for tree clearing and tree replacement. I'm not aware of any caps on that, but it is part of if it's required for replacement, and it needs to be in line with the magnitude or the replacement funds need to be in line with the magnitude of what is being replaced. And so that's the level of replacement that we're talking about here in the corridor.
Thanks, Jim. Another question related to ridership, asking when the last onboard ridership survey was completed and when the next one is slated. And I'll send that to Andy.
Yes, thanks, Adele. We were able to confirm here. The last one was done in 2018 and the update is planned for 2022.
Thank you. So another question about downtown White Bear Lake, asking with the new high school moving to Division Street, there will be a significant volume of traffic in downtown White Bear Lake using Highway 61. How will safety be handled with BRT buses coming in at the same time as school times? And I think maybe I'll direct this one to Andy first, maybe added on to by Jim if needed.
Yeah, 6 buses an hour really isn't a significant volume to impact traffic in a negative way. Highway 61 is close to 25,000 vehicles that are on it. A couple of things to keep in mind too is we anticipate people to use the service, potentially having transit riders that are there are potentially single occupants, are potential vehicles that aren't on the roadway. If a couple of the features too that we're looking at to help with traffic and to coordinate with the high school is the addition of a new signal at 8th Street. That's going to help Rushline BRT buses circulate, but it'll also help cars get to the high school, especially in those morning and PM periods. Other things we'll be doing are pedestrian improvements at both 7th and 8th Street intersections to allow people to cross. That'll allow people to help them to access the station, but also could help get people to the campus as well going forward. I'll turn over to Jim if there's anything from the engineering side to add.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that we have been coordinating with the school district and their consultants on that area to make sure that the designs for both projects are compatible and working together seamlessly.
Thanks, Andy and Jim. So we do not have any open questions, written questions. So I might go back to our channels one more time just to see if there are any verbal questions, and give any folks a chance to write out any lingering questions, and then we can kind of see where we are and wrap up tonight's event. So I'll go over to the Hmong channel first. Okay, thank you so much for checking. And how about on the Spanish channel? Any questions? Okay, thank you. And then the Korean channel. Any questions? Okay, thank you very much. All right, we'll come back. We've got 3 additional questions submitted, and we'll start with another question about trees, asking, saying previously, you said that the environmental assessment didn't include a number of trees to be cleared, but did assume a significant number. What is considered significant? And I might ask Jessica to respond to this one.
Sure, I can do that. The identification of significant impact in the environmental assessment, while we don't have a specific number yet, is in reference to, I mean, we know that vegetation will need to be removed, especially along the railroad corridor, and that there will be a change. It will be a change. So that is how we identify significant. I can tell you that, you know, we're at a 15% level of design right now. So we are committed to doing what we can to minimize those impacts. And as we go through design, we'll also be taking a look at, you know, the types of trees, the species of trees. We've had similar comments before and have committed in the design guide to preserving those trees of high value. So I can't give a specific number right now, but that is something that's top of mind as we move forward in engineering.
Thanks, Jessica. So the next question is about running destination-driven bus routes to sporting events or airport, zoo, other kind of high intensity locations. Has this been considered? And I might ask Frank to answer this one.
Sure. So running kind of a charter service just to certain special events wouldn't meet the purpose and need of the project. So earlier in the presentation, Jessica explained the purpose and need for the project and how some of the needs associated with the project include meeting the needs of people who depend on transit and supporting sustainable development in the project area. And in order to achieve those things, what's needed is frequent all-day service that's useful for a number of different trips, you know, to help people get to school, to work, to medical appointments, shopping, education, recreation, etc. So just kind of designing the transit system around special events would not meet that purpose and need, and so that's not under consideration.
Thanks, Frank. So we had a question about how many people are on this Zoom open house and how many attended yesterday's virtual open house. Today we have 15 attendees. A few of them are staff, so there's about 10 members of the public who are on this meeting. And then yesterday we had about 30 members of the public during our afternoon session. And then we had a question come in about the percentage of funds for the project that are anticipated to be secured through federal funds versus state versus local funds. And I will send this one to Andy.
Yes, thank you, Adele. So the funding for projects like this come through a federal program called the Capital Investment Grant Program. So we do have to meet a number of different benchmarks, including ridership, cost effectiveness, environmental benefits, congestion relief, but also impacts on land use and economic development. Through that program, up to half the funding for the project can be received. We are going to be applying to that program in the fall of this year. In addition to the federal dollars, the other half of the project will come primarily from the county, and that will be two sources. One is if a sales tax that's already in place, that's 3/4 cent, that goes to fund the build out of transit in Ramsey County, as well as to pay for our share of operating costs on the Green Line and other transit corridors. And there is a smaller amount of funding from Ramsey County from the Regional Rail Authority levy. So if you are a homeowner in Ramsey County, you may see that on your property tax bill each year as a line item. And then the project does seek other funding through the state, but we don't have any other funding committed at this point for the project. And all those numbers I just gave are for construction. Once the project is in operation, there still will be a cost. Once you account for all the revenues and any money received from the fare box, those costs are assumed to be split 50-50, half from Ramsey County through those same sources, and then half through the Met Council utilizing state funding.
Thanks, Andy. All right, I think we have reached the end of our written questions. And are there any other, we might just sit tight for a minute or two and see if there are any other written questions that come up. Okay, we've had a couple of additional questions come in. The first question, will the buses have bike racks? Maybe I'll look to Frank to answer this one.
Thanks, Adele. That's an easy question. Yes, so the buses will have bike racks and the stations will also have bike racks.
Thanks, Frank. And then we've got a question asking, where are the stations in White Bear Lake and Vadnais Heights? And maybe have Andy answer that one.
I'm wondering if you could flip back to the map on the screen. If that's too troublesome, I can just verbally list them. Yes, so I can verbally explain where those stations are. The northernmost one would be in downtown White Bear Lake on Washington Avenue between 7th and 8th Street, and that's where the buses would turn around and then head back south. The next stop would be at Whitaker Street, which is where the Marina Triangle area of White Bear Lake is located. And then further south after that would be at the cross street of Cedar Avenue. And then the next stop would be at the intersection of County Road E, and that station is within Vadnais Heights. And we would be having a small shared parking facility at the TCO Sports Garden facility. And the last station in the White Bear Lake area is over on Berkeley Road, where currently the Bruce Ventle Trail terminates, just to the east of Highway 61.
All right, and once again, we've reached the end of our list of open questions. Oh, I see one just popped up, asking if we could repeat the amount of the project being funded by Ramsey County.
Yes, the amount of funding by Ramsey County would be approximately 50% of the costs to build and 50% of the costs to operate.
And then there's a second part of that question. I should have stated this earlier. It says, the EA states that the rush line would pay for itself by 2033. How many riders would that equate to?
That would be math that I'm probably not able to pull off the top of my head. That is something that we could respond to in the document, to the cumulative amount of riders.
Thank you, Andy. Sounds good. A question about travel time on Rush Line from White Bear Lake to St. Paul. And I think I will look to Andy on this one as well. Or maybe Jim.
Yeah, I think I can take that one. Right now, we are looking at about a 45 to 50 minute bus ride from the downtown White Bear Lake station, so that northernmost station, to Union Depot in St. Paul, which is the southernmost station. Those run times will continue to be refined and evaluated as the project gets closer to implementation.
Yeah,
Thanks, Jim.
And I might just add too that when we look at travel time, it's not always that end to end. In this case, there's a lot of destinations along the way too, including Maplewood Mall, St. John's Hospital, and then as you travel down into the Phelan Boulevard corridor, Regents Hospital at the north end of downtown, where you have options to transfer to other lines such as the Green Line. So we don't just look at the end-to-end trip and the travel time, but we look at those travel times between destinations as well.
Oops, sorry about that. So we, Jessica has looked up the part of the environmental assessment that had the pay for itself reference, and she has provided that, and I'll read that out loud here. So the reference is not about riders, but about the economic impact of the project. And the project would add $96 million to the gross state product during its operating phase through 2040. So from when it opens to customers through the year 2040. In 2040, employment in Minnesota would be 124 jobs higher than under the no rush line alternative. Of these, 50 jobs would be directly created by the transit industry and 74 would be jobs in other industries. A public sector project is said to pay for itself in economic terms at the point that the cumulative economic activity impact surpasses the public project cost from all sources. So the Rush Line BRT project would, in quotes, pay for itself by 2033. And maybe, Jessica, could you point us to the section of the environmental assessment where that information is, so folks can see it in context?
Yes, it is on page 37 of the environmental document. It's in section 3.2.8, economics. And that was based on a model that was run by the Met Council.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question in that asks, will all of the Bruce Vento corridor be raised? Looking at the picture on page 20 of the Rush Line Design Guide. And I might send this one to Jim.
So I think that's an easy question, and the answer is no. Not all the Bruce Vento Trail corridor will be raised. There are varying conditions in the corridor now for where the Bruce Vento Trail is, and that will continue to be the case through much of the corridor. The guideway and Bruce Vento Trail will remain at the same elevation that it is today, whether that's at grade level with the surrounding topography raised, or in some cases lowered compared to the surrounding topography. Adele, you're on mute still.
Oh, thank you. We don't have any open questions right now, so we'll sit tight for a minute or two here and see if there are any last lingering questions. We do have about 10 minutes remaining in our time together. Okay, we've had a few more questions just pop up. The first one asking, will any additional sessions be held due to low turnout by the public on these sessions? I might dispute the low turnout, but there will be additional sessions. And the second question was, how will the public in-person meeting on June 17th be handled? So I think those are very related to one another. I might turn this one over to Frank to answer.
Sure. So yeah, as that second question alluded to, there is one more open house on June 17th. That one will be in an in-person format. We, Ramsey County, are coordinating with our public health department on COVID-19 protocols. Obviously, there have been some changes in the regulations recently, so we're trying to wrap our head around those to make sure that we're holding the event in a way that's safe for people. We are thinking we'll be asking people to wear masks, and we'll have staff wearing masks and practicing social distancing at that June 17th meeting. It'll be at Union Depot, 4 to 7 p.m. You can show up anytime and speak to a member of the project team and offer public comment on the environmental assessment.
And Adele, I may just add too that although these are the 3 open houses for the environmental assessment, the project, as it continues in its design, there will be more meetings and more opportunities for the public to provide feedback. I'll reiterate that our construction is still roughly 3 years out before starting.
Thanks, Andy. So we have a question here that says, we live on the Bruce Vento corridor and are wondering when we will know the impact to our space and how that will be communicated. I think, Andy, I might look to you to answer this one as well.
Sure. What we will continue to do, if you are directly adjacent when we have meetings like this, we have been making sure to do things like mailings just to make sure that people who are directly adjacent have been informed and opportunity to provide input. We have done things in the past, and we've been out on the corridor, have done walking tours or different pop-up events. That was our ability to do that this past year, and the pandemic was limited, but we expect to continue that in the future. Also, as the project moves forward, now that we've got a preliminary design, now that we have a design guide, it's a great time, probably into the next year timeframe, to start having more more micro level conversations with some of the property owners about specific impacts down to the couple feet line, where we're kind of at the high level right now. So we do anticipate those opportunities coming in the future, and if you are adjacent to the corridor, you'll continue to be contacted about those.
Thanks, Andy. And one last question asking about security on the line. I think this might also be a question for you, Andy.
Yeah,
keeping you busy.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So transit facilities in the Twin Cities follow best practices for safety and security, with multiple security cameras, emergency call buttons, and open layouts that are well covered with lighting for high visibility. The Rush Line BRT stations, along with any of the park and ride lots, will have these same safety features. There'll also be uniformed and plainclothes Metro Transit police that continually patrol transit routes and vehicles and stations. Bus drivers themselves also serve somewhat as an eyes on the street and have that instant radio and silent communications with police dispatch. The Metro Transit Police also works closely with the local law enforcement. And I would say over this past year, there's been a lot of efforts, some of them at the legislature, some within the county and our funding streams too, on other lines to improve safety and security. And we're hoping that there'll be more changes and improvements as we move forward into the future.
Thanks, Andy. One question here: if there has been any thought given for the long term of using a dedicated lane for autonomous vehicles as the technology becomes more reliable? And I think I look to Andy on this one as well.
It seems like Jim is, as our engineer expert, is biting at the bit to talk about technology. So I'll defer.
Okay, works for me.
I can say that there have not been a lot of conversations about that within the Rush Line project itself. There's a lot of legislative things to work out in terms of things like that. But there's definitely those opportunities in the future, like it was stated, as technology evolves and as practices change. The dedicated space that's being used for transit could also be used for other things like that.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions if anyone has any. And feel free to write them. And if you did want to ask a verbal question, you can use the raise hand feature. I might do one last check in with our folks on the other channels. We'll go to Mung first. Any questions? Okay, thank you. How about from the Spanish channel? channel. Any questions? Okay. Yes, thank you. How about the Corinne channel? Any questions there? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so it looks like we had one last question come in. I think this will have to be our last question, asking, stating it looks like there are 48 parking spaces lost in downtown White Bear Lake and asking if they will be replaced. I'm wondering maybe if Jessica, this is a question you could answer.
Yeah, I may also call on Jim, but that is correct. And those are at the White Bear Shopping Center area. So off street, off Highway 61. Jim, anything else there?
Yeah, I think the only thing I want to clarify there is, they're in White Bear Lake. They're not necessarily in their downtown core, but they are, in the city of White Bear Lake. And many of the cases that we're talking about are primarily what we're talking about are parking spaces that are in public right of way that are being impacted as part of the project.
All right, thanks Jessica and Jim for that. And thanks to all of you for participating and for your thoughtful questions. We appreciate your participation tonight. And I think this concludes our evening virtual open house. Again, if you would like to join us in person, the evening meeting is coming up on June 17th. It'll be at Union Depot. And you can visit rushline.org for more information about that meeting or to submit any comments on the environmental assessment. Thanks for joining us.